Are you an emotional person, and do your emotions affect the decisions that you make in both your personal and professional life? Well, according to research from Medium, it found that 90 to 95% of our decision making is affected by our emotions. So it's critical to determine and decide how we are going to manage our emotions to make sound and coherent decisions which will have a positive benefit on the trajectory of how we live our everyday life. Hannah Mayderry is a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology and cultural anthropology while living in Southern California. Then she moved home to Florida to earn her Master of Arts degree in education and, as well, an education specialist degree from the University of Florida. For Mayderry, talking about emotions is her absolute favorite thing to do. Growing up, she was told that she was entirely too sensitive, only to discover later in life that her emotions and expressing her feelings were one of her greatest strengths. It was during this realization that she decided to dedicate her life to specializing in therapy and focusing on self-esteem, anxiety, relationship issues, and religious trauma. And Mayderry loves what she does because she gets to positively impact people. And she joined me this week to have a conversation about increasing self-esteem, self-worth, overcoming anxiety and trauma, and so much more. I'm so excited to bring you this comprehensive conversation of great value. So, without further delay, I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. Hannah, if you're ready, I'll take a moment to welcome you to the program. And I'm super excited to talk to you this afternoon all about emotions. Great to see you today, and happy Monday to you.
Thank you. You as well.
Absolutely. So, Hannah, you tell me that your absolute favorite thing to do in life is to talk about emotions. So, I'm wondering why it's so important to you and why you're so fascinated with the study of emotions.
I think it really started with just feeling emotion. I think we're all emotional people, but we experience them on different levels. And some of us feel them really intensely, where others are a bit more distant. For me, I've always felt them very intensely, my own emotions, as well as just perceiving the emotions of others as well, which is as much of a curse as it is a blessing, I would say, because it's just a lot of sensory input to take in at one time. And I think just when I found academia and when I was able to give language to some of my own experiences, it's my favorite thing to talk about, I suppose, because it's what I experience the most intensely in my day-to-day life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you have a sort of personal connection to wanting to help people through their own emotions and their emotional journey. So I'm wondering if you can tell me about how this affects you from a personal level as well.
Yeah, I always say that growing up in my home, talking about emotions was never optional, just because the nature of who my parents were. Also, being someone who was very sensitive, I could recognize myself that I was sensitive. I was also told that a lot. So that doesn't just mean emotionally sensitive, but also, like I mentioned before, a lot of sensory input was really overwhelming for me. Never been a good multitasker. There were too many things going on at one time. I felt really overwhelmed. Um, and so I think those aren't the best combination of things to deal with when you're going through grade school. And that was hard for me because I think the way that I interpreted the world was we all interpret the world differently, but I think I was just very sensitive to a lot of different things. Also, really struggled with anxiety. And then, kind of moving out of my childhood, teenage years into my early adult years, being able to give language to my own experiences and harness it as a strength for myself and ultimately build a career out of it as a therapist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that one of the ways you help people through that is by letting them sort of express their self-esteem issues. And you also deal with relationship issues as well. So I'm curious to ask you, how do you think those two things are interconnected, and how you work with your clients to achieve sort of the relationship and life balance as well?
Yeah, the relationship and life balance between what exactly?
Between, managing their emotions and building up their self-esteem.
Yeah, I think, there's a really interesting intersectionality for therapists when they're choosing their specialties. It's between what they've experienced personally, which leads into what they're passionate about, what they have encountered in their professional training, and then what their clients have taught them. Therapist specialties, it's a little bit different than, say, a medical doctor who goes through school, goes through residency, and then specializes in something very specific. Therapist specialties, it's cool because they can constantly evolve and change as we learn more about ourselves, learn more about other people, learn more about our field. So I think my experience, or the reason why I choose to specialize in the things I specialize in now, like self-esteem and anxiety, is a culmination of a lot of things. I get to have conversations with people about harnessing their personal power when maybe a lot of their energy at the time being is invested in criticizing themselves. Also, helping people understand that anxiety is at its worst, very dysfunctional, but at its best, very functional, and it can progress us forward and give us the motivation to accomplish things that we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Hannah, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today, and I was excited to do so, was I wanted to talk to you about the notion of building social capital and being vulnerable. One of the reasons that I started this podcast was, I started this 3 years ago, just around the pandemic time, Hannah, and I said
Mm-hmm.
to myself that there had to be sort of a link between uh, building what I call bridges of unity when we were all going through the pandemic time. And I also told myself that there was only so much Netflix I could watch through the pandemic, and so
Yeah.
I wanted a space where people could be open and vulnerable about their feelings, because I really think there's a strength in vulnerability. So I'm curious to get your professional and personal opinion on the strength of vulnerability and how it can help us better express our emotions.
Yeah, there's such a delicate balance to that. I think vulnerability is beautiful because it's what allows us to build deep connections with other people, and also, as many of us know all too well, sometimes we can be harmed when we're too vulnerable with someone, or when we're vulnerable with someone who we think is trustworthy, and then they turn out to not be trustworthy. So I think the practice of vulnerability is investing in the relationships that you trust, while also being able to adapt and adjust and set healthy boundaries when you're vulnerable with someone who didn't necessarily have your best interest in mind, and kind of reeling it back a little bit and protecting yourself in that particular instance, while also still knowing that there's power in continuing to connect with other people as well. Because if we're not honest with ourselves, I'll say this. A lot of times I'll tell my clients, and I remind myself as well, that if we are portraying something that is contrary to who we actually are, or if we're withholding elements of ourselves, we're never really fostering the opportunity for connections to build that are representative of our authentic selves. So the more we can be vulnerable, or in other words, be authentic and be transparent with what we're thinking and feeling, the more likely we are to build connections that are meaningful to us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, how managing emotions is not easy for a lot of people in terms of asking for help when they're in a dark place or they need assistance in working through mental health issues. So I'm curious to ask you about the power of asking for help and also knowing that you need it as well. So how do you help people sort of navigate their own sort of ask for assistance, and how powerful can it be once you ask for the assistance that you need?
Yeah, I think I'm in a unique position because um, when I'm working with people, one of the hardest steps has kind of already taken place because someone has reached out for help or they have tried to connect with the therapist, which is a really hard thing to do to begin with, especially if you believe that maybe your struggles aren't worth receiving help, or you're not worthy of help in some way, or it's sometimes it's even not possible to invest that time in yourself, whether that be just because of time commitments and or the emotional capacity that you have, or financial components are a thing to discuss as well. But with that being said, when I'm already in session with someone, a lot of times, kind of connecting with what I said earlier, we can really withhold what we need or what we want or what we're thinking from others because we think that that's going to be a burden to them, or that they're going to think poorly of us in some way. And what we're not realizing is that we're spending so much energy making sure all of these other people are okay and holding up this perception of ourselves among all of these different people, when really if we could just release what it is that we're actually thinking, what it is that we need, what it is that we're struggling with, we really do open up the opportunity for deeper conversations and authentic connection.
Yeah, you talk about conversation and connection, and I'm curious, how do you think emotions play a part in building strong and healthy relationships that add value to our lives? What would you say about the power of building relationships?
Gosh, I don't even know where to start with that. I mean, our emotions are cues that tell us that something is either going very, very well or very, very wrong. Sometimes they can get a little out of whack because we can experience things that maybe set our emotional sensors off a little bit, and there needs to be some adjusting there. But for the most part, when we're with someone, and I don't mean to sound corny, but I used to call myself a hopeless romantic. Now I just call myself a romantic because I do believe in the power of love and connection. But when we're with someone and it feels warm and it feels wonderful and it feels safe, like, we got to keep expressing ourselves and building upon the connection that we're feeling there. When something feels unsafe, when someone really isn't curious about our perspective or holding space for us in a way that feels productive, then that gives us the indication that we need to reel it back. Also, emotions can tell us when we're passionate about something and we need to pursue it more. For me, that was therapy or just psychology in general. I'm really passionate about this. It allowed me to keep pursuing it. I think if we tune our emotions out and we're not in connection with them, then we miss out on a really great opportunity to connect with our own intuition.
Yeah, and to that point, Hannah, how important do you think is to follow our passion in relating to our emotions, and really finding a linkage or a correlation between our passion, which ultimately will help us sort of express our emotions better. So how do you think the two things are linked?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. I think one, first, a little bit of a warning comes to mind because sometimes we can be really passionate about things that are still emotionally raw for us. And we need to make sure that in therapy, we would call this countertransference, which means when I'm working with a client and I have an emotional reaction to something that they're sharing, I need to make sure that I'm keeping myself in check and not projecting what I'm feeling onto them. Sometimes the things that we're the most passionate about can hold such an emotional weight that it almost feels overwhelming to do that in our daily lives. With that being said, I think that there's, my whole therapy practice, or honestly, kind of my whole philosophy of life is just taking control of the things that we can. One thing that we can control is tapping into our own intuition. Our intuition tells us what feels right for us, what feels wrong for us, what makes us happy, what makes us exhausted. And if we pay attention to those cues and follow them one after the other, even though it's not this perfect linear path, I really do believe that that gets us to much happier places in life. That it goes for career, relationships, hobbies, where to live, everything. I think there's so many emotional cues around all of those things that if we follow, we can pave a much more sustainable path for ourselves.
Yeah, and then I asked you earlier about society and emotions, and I wanted to go back to it for just a second and ask you about, you know, living in today's society. If you're not careful on the news sources that you
Mm.
consume, you can really go into a dark place or place which would be hard to come back from. So, how do you think we can use our emotions to sort of heal the societal divisions that we're seeing today in society?
Well, I'm not a sociologist, so I'll refrain from commenting on more than what's out of the scope of my practice. But I think on an individual level, I think you're right. All that's going on into the world. I mean, if you think back, like just historically, not that long ago, it's relatively new in society that we have constant sources of news about things, tragedies that are happening all over the world. That is a lot for any one person to hold at one time. And that can have such a massive weight on our mental health. I think it's so important to find balance between keeping ourselves informed and also acknowledging that in a world in which there is so much that is outside of our control, tragedies that are happening by the second that are broadcasted all over the news, the one thing that we can control, or there's a multitude of things that we can control, but one of the most important is how we engage with other people and how we care for ourselves and how we show up for the people and places in our immediate vicinity.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the other end of the spectrum, and I'm curious to ask you how we can utilize our emotions to experience joy in life.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
In terms of, experiencing happiness and being emotional about uh, positive events in our lives, how do you think we can use positive momentum and emotions to experience happiness and joy in life?
You mentioned presence. I think that's so fundamental. Being able to be present in what's actually happening in the moment and not getting too lost in what's happened in the past or what's going to happen in the future. I mean, beautiful moments happen every single day. I get really happy when I try a new coffee shop. Very small thing, but sometimes maybe that's the most exciting thing that's happening in my day, and that's still very exciting. A lot of times we can assume that big life events or even small ones are going to hold inherent joy. But if we don't recognize the joy in them or we don't pay attention to the little ways in which they have the potential to make us happy, then we may never experience that. Another thing that I'll say to that point is something that I've noticed I need to be more clear about in my own practice is that the purpose of therapy, or I'll say the purpose of emotional growth or personal growth in general, is not to eliminate negative emotions or to eliminate any mental health concerns. That is absolutely impossible. There's never going to be a time in my life when I don't experience anxiety on some level. And there's never going to be, well, I mean, where at which anxiety will be completely eliminated for the forever future. And there's ever never there's also never going to be a time when I'm never going to feel insecure again. However, I can build resilience to the emotional struggles that I do face, and I can be present in moments of life that have the opportunity for a lot of joy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah, outside of hosting this podcast, I do some motivational speaking around the concept and topic of resilience. And I always tell people that
Mm,
your resiliency is the answer to the test of adversity. So, how do you think resilience is interconnected to overcoming adversity?
gosh, these are great questions. I think, I don't even know what to add. I think you summed it up so perfectly. We are all dealt a random deck of cards in this life. And then there's a lot of obstacles and hurdles that come after that. When we're faced with those things, we can say, woe is me, I'm not capable of overcoming this. Or we have the opportunity to say, this really sucks. And also, here are the things within my control that I am going to use to continue on and to work with the resources that I have outside of this hurdle. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of inclusion, in my own personal life, Hannah,
Mm,
I'll just tell you a quick story. So, at the age of 9, Hannah, I was born with what's called spastic quadriplegia cerebral palsy. It simply means that I don't have enough oxygen in my legs to walk normally. And, at the age of 9, I was told that I wouldn't be able to walk without assistance for the duration of my
mm,
life. And I always have looked at life and I tell myself that I don't allow my personal restrictions to sort of dictate my lot in life. And I've dedicated my life to promoting an atmosphere of inclusion for all people. So, what do you think
mm.
about the concept of inclusion, emotions, and bringing people together? How do you think all three of those things are interconnected?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is just open mindedness, however simple or cliche that may sound. We have to have a rough concept. Like everyone walks into every conversation with a rough interpretation of how they imagine it might go, or maybe some assumptions about what someone's experience might be. It's impossible to eliminate all of those assumptions completely, but if we approach every conversation to the best of our ability with open mindedness, the ability to learn about someone else's perspective, curiosity is at the foundation of all of that too. Sometimes we can just approach things with these stone walls of assumptions and not even really, or maybe we feel uncomfortable talking about other people's struggles because we feel like like we don't know how to help or we don't know how to respond. But if we just show up, hold space, be curious, I think there's so much to learn.
Absolutely. And getting back to emotions just for a moment, Hannah, I'm curious if someone was watching or listening to this today and they asked you to put together a roadmap of how to manage emotions effectively, and they asked you for your top three top three recommendations. I'm curious, what would you tell them and why?
Top three recommendations. Okay. It's not three perfect points. Bear with me. But first, you have to even be able to identify what it is that you are experiencing. A lot of times when I'm working with people, are, all throughout sessions, really, but if someone's struggling to identify what they're going through or when they're feeling what they're feeling, I encourage them to just journal in the moment, not journal like every day, sit down, dear diary, today I felt da 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 da, but instead to sit down or to just even pull out your phone in the moment and say, I'm feeling anxious right now and I don't know why. My chest is tight right now and I don't know why. I'm feeling hopeless right now and I don't know why. If we can identify what it is in the moment, then we have a foundation to get curious about. From there, you have to work to understand where some of these feelings are coming from. Whatever feeling we're experiencing is our body and our minds telling us something is wrong, something needs to be changed. Sometimes that can be true. Maybe there is an actual danger that we're sensing, or that we need to pay attention to. Sometimes our sensors are going off because we've experienced something in the past and the present moment is triggering it. So if we can understand really the pathology of where that comes from, that's super exciting. That gives us the opportunity to be able to learn more. And then from there, adjusting your behavior accordingly based on what you know in the present moment. So if we know what we're feeling, why we're feeling it, then we can determine how we need to respond. And over time, we can start to build new neural pathways and new ways of thinking about things that can benefit us in the present instead of just serving our past selves.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah, when we talk about the concept of self empowerment or self improvement, how do you think we can cultivate self empowerment in our own lives and really take ownership of the things that we want to accomplish in life?
I think you've been hinting at it, or I've mentioned it a lot throughout this whole conversation. It's identifying that which you cannot control, grieving that, processing the pain, that's emotional pain that's associated with that. And then that frees up so much emotional energy to take control of what you can. So getting curious about what you want, what you don't want, what you like, what you don't, how you feel about things, what you're passionate about. And then even if you don't know exactly what to do with that after you ask yourself a multitude of questions, if you continue to show up in life being open to opportunities and being mindful of what will serve you and what won't serve you, then you can make small decisions at a time that build upon themselves and promote a sense of self-empowerment.
Yeah, and Hannah, for you personally, I'm fascinated when you go home at night or in a private moment. How do you define victory in your own life?
Hmm. Victory. I think it's a tough word for me. I think I've set myself up for failure sometimes in my own definition of what that means. So maybe I've reclaimed that word a little bit for myself. I think victory for me, I now see as personal fulfillment. So if I am, so right now, a lot of my life is consumed with my therapy practice and being in private practice. I made that transition about a year ago. And so I could easily define victory by some sort of number of clients that I had, or some sort of online presence that I had, or how successful I was by society standards in comparison to other people around me. But I've really worked hard to reframe that. And so I suppose victory for me right now is making sure that I am passionate about what I'm doing. I find it fulfilling. I'm not dreading showing up to work every single day, and that I can care for myself and the people around me and enjoy life in the way that I want to enjoy life.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a follow up of that's connected to that. When you think about the concept of hope, both in your personal and professional life, how do you define your heartbeat of hope?
For me personally,
Personally or professionally, you can take it either way.
hope it can almost feel spiritual to me sometimes, and I think everyone has such a different interpretation of what that means for them or where it comes from. It can connect to a lot of different religious philosophies as well. For me personally, it's just the faith that life will continue to move on, and that I have power and authority over my own life in whatever capacity I can harness. Knowing that when I am overwhelmed, when I am in a lot of emotional pain, is momentary, maybe not meaning just a literal minute, but it is temporary, and that I will feel okay again, because I can recognize that in the past I've been through immense emotional pain and I've come out on the other side okay again and able to move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hannah, my final question for you today has to do with what brings the biggest smile to your face. And when you think about your own personal and professional legacy, how do you want that to be defined?
I think right now what brings the biggest smile on my face is just being able to connect with other people. Connecting with clients is amazing. And then personally, being able to connect with the people in my life that I love and care about. When I think about legacy, it's something that's been on my mind a lot recently because in the last couple of years, I've lost a few people who have passed away who are really close to me. So that really puts into perspective, really heavy questions, existential crises, meaning of life, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The people that I love and respect the most have been those who have been kind, even when I'm sure it was very difficult to be kind, loving, authentic, who were able to pay attention to, or who were able to honor times that were really difficult while also continuing to celebrate even the smallest things in life. So I suppose, I hope if I died today, I hope I would be remembered as someone who was kind and compassionate and loving and was nice to be around, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I lied. I just have one more question for you because I know that you're back in Florida now, but I know you've also lived in other places, and you lived for a time in Southern California, and you even went to school out there. So I'm curious to ask you about the value of life experience and how we can use our life experience to better manage our emotions as well.
Yeah, when you move to a new place, especially I remember the first time that I moved out of state, it felt like just like a giant zoom out. I moved without knowing anyone. I didn't have any connections there when I first moved away for school when I was in Southern California. So it just felt like maybe before I was like looking at everything on a microscopic level, I was in a very small town, and then all of a sudden my whole life exploded, and I was just every single day was a new experience. There's been a lot of times, sometimes I struggle with anxiety. Sometimes anxiety can leave you feeling very trapped. You can feel like there's no way out, that everything that ever has happened or ever could happen is just right in front of you, and it feels like you're just running on this hamster wheel that you can't get out of. And then having had a multitude of those experiences at this point in my life, and realizing that when I feel like I can't move forward, that this, nothing's going to get better, that nothing's going to change. I've now had a lot of experiences that have shown me that even when I didn't have the answers in the moment and I felt like everything was crumbling down, actually, life kept moving. And that doesn't mean that I'm going back and belittling my emotions in the moment. Those were very valid. However, I now have, I think, a larger scope of just, life continuing to move and progress and change.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Hannah, tell me if people want to get connected with you personally or your practice, what's the best way they can do that?
Yeah, so for my personal mental health reasons, I choose not to use social media. So I just have a website online. It's called philosophytherapy.com, philosophy spelled with IE. And I have a contact page that anyone could reach out to me at. But that's the best way to get in contact with me.
Well, fabulous, Hannah. I really want to thank you for diving into the subject of emotions, our mental health, and how they're interconnected. Your work in the space and time on my behalf this afternoon is most appreciated, and I want to thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.